So, I like how Ezra and Kanan are capable of standing toe to toe with the Inquisitors now, not because they have functionally leveled up, not because they're stronger per se, but because they're coordinating more. And between that coordination and teamwork, they can withstand against the two, who you'll notice are not coordinating at all, and in fact are usually vying with each other more than anything else. Pretty typical dark side. But it's funny to me, especially because they both play to their strengths. Kanan has always been particularly good at force push, and Ezra's always been particularly good at, what is it, animal friendship or whatever? You remember how that's a light side power that everyone made fun of back in the day? I like how Ezra's been making good use of it since then. So then we have a nice scene with Anakin with a weird looking outfit. Apparently, they were really having issues keeping this episode under budget with regards to render since there were so many new things they had to render, including Yoda. But they mention he was the greatest warrior in the Clone Wars and very kind. What I find interesting is Ahsoka mentions that the last thing she heard was he was rushing off to save the Chancellor. Huh. I'm curious. Well, I wish that was shown in the Clone Wars, is basically all I have to say about that. Or in the movie. Seeing Ahsoka in the movie would have been awesome, but of course I don't think she was even invented at that point in time, so whatever. Once again, they go back to the temple to try and reach Yoda very literally and deliberately through the ley line focus thing I mentioned earlier, the last time they were here. It still all makes sense, and I'm still with it. And I want to talk about something else here. I've mentioned before this very season that I don't get into the more mysticism, vagueness of Star Wars in general. But I do kind of like the vision stuff, because in my mind, the vision stuff is different. It's a very specific and deliberate illusion designed to show a aspect and shard of an individual's personality and perspective. So we see three here, of course, because all three are there. I want to talk about Kanan's first. So my first note here is, isn't that Jason Isaacs playing the voice of the Temple Guard? Well, yeah, it actually was. That the Grand Inquisitor was once one of the guards of the temple, and that he was tempted to the dark side, and blah, blah, blah. It feels interesting to me, given how he has in many ways been portrayed as a more, I don't want to use the word honorable, but less sadistic, less pointlessly stupid than several other Sith have been. I mentioned that in his final confrontation when he finally ended up dying, and we kind of see the beginnings of why that is here. I think this is the last time we'll functionally see him. I could be wrong about that, but it's nice to get that little bit of backstory. And of course, what he says is makes perfect sense. Yes, your apprentice will fall to the dark side and you will fail. Because that's exactly what Kanan's afraid of. As I've already said, as I've already enunciated on, keeping in mind I hadn't even seen this show, I was just reading into the character. Of course Kanan is terrified of Ezra falling to the dark side. Why wouldn't he be? Given what he has seen happen. Given what he knows, how he knows this goes. Because it's already happened. He also, there's this nice little bit where he's desperately trying to fight back against them, and he decides to pick up a second lightsaber, and he picks one at random, and it's red. And then over the course of the fight, he loses his blue lightsaber, so the only weapon left to him is the dark side, and thus he chooses to cease his fight. And in so doing, basically, the Grand Inquisitor accepts that you have succeeded where I have failed. I will delay the enemy. Go. It's a very powerful scene. A bit obvious, but still powerful for me. I love the symbolism on display. See, I'm going to get into opinion here for a second. One of the things I've always hated about several insights into the Jedi Order is how pacifist they are. Now, don't mistake me. I'm not a particularly bloodthirsty person, but I do think pacifism can also be taken to an extreme, to the point where a Jedi is too willing to do nothing and just, it'll all work itself out, rather than actually trying to get involved in some way. But that is the complex choice to be made, going back to what I mentioned about Ezra earlier, that it is simple to stay pacifist. It is simple to just be violent and just fight. It is far more complex to know when you should do which and why. And I love this perspective on this, because that's what this episode showcases. In Ezra's conversation with Yoda, and in Kanan's conversation with the Grand Inquisitor. In both cases, we see that sometimes, fighting is the answer and sometimes it is not, and you have to be fighting for the right reasons and the right ways. In other words, fighting is too simple of an answer. What we need is a more complex answer. And this, going over to Ezra, this is a nice bit, where Ezra says, no, we've already made our choice. We've chosen to fight. Yoda's response is just to sigh tiredly. Because to fight is too simple of an answer. I like the little tidbit Ahsoka adds, by the way. He never told me what he was actually like, what he felt. I'm not sure anyone knew what he felt. Yoda had a lot going on. And as I've mentioned, we are now at the post-humbling stage. But what I love even more about this episode is how willing Yoda is to admit how much they screwed up. I mean, hindsight is 20/20 and all that, but it is harder than it sounds. I'm sure most of you know what I'm talking about, to admit your flaws and your mistakes, to say, I did that and I was wrong to do that. In our arrogance, joined the conflict too swiftly we did. And he mentions flat out, he was afraid. Of course Yoda was afraid. How could he not be? My mom used to say that the really smart people are the ones who are the most cursed because they see just how things actually are in the world. And I feel that was Yoda's position back in the Old Order, to see just how bad things really were. I like Yoda's answer, by the way. You have to choose. I wrote it down. How choose to win, the question is. In other words, again, going back to that complex thing, it's not just about killing the enemy. Remember, Ezra came there specifically saying, we need help to defeat the Inquisitors and Vader. And as I've pointed out before, the question there is basically wrong. The definition of victory is what really needs to be considered here. The last thing I have to mention is Ahsoka's tidbit. Where were you when I needed you? Now, this is by far the most demonstration of just her internal thoughts. The guilt and shame and horror she has carried with her for a decade and a half. The thought that if I had been there, Anakin wouldn't have turned to the dark side. We've actually debated this a lot as geeks over the years since. And in fact, I've been asked questions directly related to this point several times on my show. I feel that Ahsoka might have been able to save Anakin Skywalker, but even that is just a maybe. As I've said so many times, Anakin had everything stacked against him. But you can't tell me that in character, Ahsoka doesn't think that she could have been the one thing to save her old friend. So then we're going to Korriban. Oh, excuse me, they're calling it Malachor. This goes back to what I mentioned a few episodes ago. We want to make a reference, but we're not allowed to. Okay, it's not Korriban, it's Malachor. Sure, whatever, we'll call it that. Yeah. Either way, interesting stuff developing. I'll see you guys next time.